Hi, I'm Deb Brinkman. Welcome to our presentation tonight. We'll be hearing from Beth Fraser from Secretary of State Ritchie's office. Beth is Deputy Secretary of the State, and she's going to be talking to us tonight about voting rights. And voting rights is something we worked so hard for so long. And it seems like every time you turn around, there's something changing, you know, here one time, gone the next time. I hope after we hear from Beth, we'll all have a little bit better appreciation of what we're doing in the state of Minnesota to keep up with technology, to keep modernizing the system. And I hope we come with a deeper appreciation of what we've done or what we need to do to maintain the voting rights that we have worked so hard to earn. A couple of housekeeping tips before I get started. I do have a sign-up sheet, and I would like to be passing that around as we get started, and also some program evaluation sheets. And Beth said it was all right if you take a moment as this is going around to fill that out. Also, another tip, we'll have time for questions at the end. If you have a question, if you would please step back to the microphone back there, and then everyone will be able to hear you. Any other questions? Okay, without further ado, Beth Fraser. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for the opportunity to be here. As she said, my name is Beth Fraser, and I'm the Deputy Secretary of State. Work with Secretary Mark Ritchie and have worked for him since he was elected. So I began with the office in January 2007 and was recently appointed the Deputy Secretary position. So I am excited to be here. I've long worked on voting rights issues, both in this position and prior to that. I ran an organization that the State League is part of called the Voting Rights Coalition. And so this is near and dear to my heart, and am excited to be able to share some information with you and at the end answer some questions and have kind of a dialogue about voting rights and where we're going. So some of the things I'm hoping to I messed up the presentation already. Okay, I'm not very technically savvy. Okay, there we go. So some of the things I'm going to cover tonight, sorry about that, are changes made by the legislature, so election law changes made this past spring in 2013, talking about the legislatively required or electronic roster task force and the electronic roster pilot project. Talk about some of the initiatives of our office as well as next session and beyond. And so our office works on elections, as you know, as well as business services and Safe at Home. So 2013, we were proposing legislation and dealing with, in the context of the 2012 election results, as well as the governor has stated previously that all election law changes need to have bipartisan support. So that affected what was politically viable during the legislative session. And so there were some things that I believe had a majority of support among legislators, but that didn't ultimately get passed because they didn't necessarily have broad bipartisan support. So there was a big elections bill that was ultimately passed and signed at the end of the session that included these elements, and I'll go into more depth about each of them, but it included no excuse absentee voting. It expanded the use of mail voting, which is where it's usually used in small communities in greater Minnesota, where registered voters, instead of having a polling place to go to on election day, all registered voters are mailed a ballot to their home. It lowered the threshold for taxpayer-funded recounts. It established a task force as well as a pilot project to look at electronic rosters. And it created clear processes for vacancy and nominations, which is a geeky election term that election geeks like me like to use, which basically means what do you do if a candidate dies or drops out? It creates basically a vacancy on the ballot. That's what that means. So, to go into a little more depth, no excuse absentee voting was one of the biggest changes made by the legislature. And basically, up until now, we have had absentee voting in Minnesota for a long time, but it was only open to people who could swear under penalty of perjury that they were going to be reasonably expected to be out of the precinct, or that they were ill or disabled, or there were certain reasons that counted, and if you couldn't swear that one of those reasons applied to you, then you were not legally allowed to vote by absentee ballot. So the legislature said, we're going to get rid of the need to give an excuse because they didn't believe that every single person who voted by absentee ballot, all 250,000 in big years, were out of town or ill or disabled, and that it made sense to get rid of the requirement that people tell white lies. So that is the real thing that changed with absentee voting. It didn't change other procedures related to absentee voting. We still have all the same requirements, other than on the application needing to state that you have a reason. You still have to apply for the absentee ballot. It still has to be sent to you. And if you're doing what we have in Minnesota, which is called in-person absentee voting. So either you can get an absentee ballot in the mail, or if you go to the city hall, for example, or your county auditor's office, they'll give you an absentee ballot in person. If you do that, you're still required to fill out all the forms and put it in an envelope to be opened later. But this does bring Minnesota closer to other states, including all of our neighbors, who allow voters to vote absentee without providing an excuse, and also offer early voting. So this is a map of who has no excuse absentee voting, and you'll see that up until this year, Minnesota was gray, and the gray states are states that do not allow, this map is where Minnesota was. So this map reflects that Minnesota did require an excuse to vote absentee and does not have early voting, which is defined as going into your city hall or county auditor's office and being able to not only fill out the ballot ahead of time, but actually put it into a ballot machine as you would on election day. So Minnesota is fairly unique in the upper Midwest in not allowing either of those options. And with the change that the legislature made, Minnesota will turn yellow, the same color as New Jersey, which I don't know if you can tell. We will allow people to vote absentee without excuse, but will still not allow early voting. So we're still unique in the upper Midwest. All of our neighbors do allow, and most states do allow voters to go in early and cast a ballot and put it right into the ballot machine. So the no excuse absentee voting was passed by the legislature last spring, but it does not take effect until the August primary next year. So cities that had elections this past fall, voters still had to provide an excuse. It's not in effect yet. And it also allows for voters to sign up on a permanent basis to get an absentee ballot application mailed to them. So we have for years allowed people who had one of the excuses apply to them. So if somebody was permanently disabled, they could sign up to be a permanent absentee voter. Now, anyone can sign up to be a permanent absentee voter, but that does not mean that you will be automatically mailed a ballot before each election. It means that you will automatically be mailed an application to apply for a ballot. We had suggested that that might be confusing for people, and that if people have indicated an interest in voting absentee on an ongoing basis, it would perhaps be better to just send them the ballot automatically, but we were not successful at convincing legislators of that. So you can still sign up to have the application sent to you prior to each election. So another big change had to do with mail ballot elections. And as I said, these are primarily used in greater Minnesota in small communities. And so up until now, it's been limited to communities with fewer than 400 registered voters. And then it allows the community to mail a ballot directly to every registered voter in the area. And this was expanded by the legislature so that any town in Greater Minnesota will be able to opt to vote by mail. And it saves money for at least small jurisdictions and for some jurisdictions where people have to travel very far, because instead of paying election judges to sit there all day in the polling place, they instead pay postage to mail the ballots to all the registered voters, and then don't have separate polling places on election day. If somebody on election day decides they want to vote, they have to go to the county auditor's office. Another piece of the bill, and we're using some acronyms here that I know are not helpful for people who are not election geeks like me. But for years, or for a couple years, voters have been able to track the status of their absentee ballot on our website. And so if you applied for an absentee ballot, you could go on our website during a state election and find out, is it in the mail yet? Or I mailed it back in. Have they gotten it yet? Did they accept it, or did I make a mistake? So you've been able to check the status of your absentee ballot, but that hasn't been true of mail ballots. So people that live in these communities where ballots are mailed to people, they did not have that ability. And so the legislature provided our office with some funding so that we could program our systems, including SVRS, which stands for the Statewide Voter Registration System, so that in future elections, starting with the primary next year, people in mail ballot precincts will have the same ability to check in on the status of their ballot and give themselves some peace of mind that it is in the mail or it has been received and or accepted. Another thing that the legislators did this past spring was they lowered the threshold for publicly funded recounts. And so for many races, it was reduced from 0.5% to 0.25%. And this was really pushed for, especially since the gubernatorial recount in 2010, where the difference between candidates Dayton and Emmer was, I think, 9,000 votes, which was less than 0.5% of all of the votes cast, but still a much wider margin than anyone ever expected to change. And in the end, the number of votes changed by a very small amount. And so people didn't necessarily think it was the best use of public funds to have to recount all of those ballots with a margin that wide. And so for statewide races, the legislature reduced the threshold to 0.25%, which still means that if we have a razor-thin race like we did when Senator Franken ran against Senator Coleman, there would still be a publicly funded recount. But in cases where the margin is wider, the public would not automatically pay. And it still allows candidates to request a recount if it exceeds this margin. So it's not saying that there cannot be a recount. It's just a question of who pays for the recount. So if we were to have the same situation and candidate Emmer wanted a recount because although there was a 9,000 vote difference, he was certain when we recounted the ballot something would change, he would have the opportunity to have a recount. It's just that he would pay for it as opposed to having the public pay the cost of all of that work. We also passed some legislation related to felons and who have lost the right to vote. Because in Minnesota, once you've been convicted of a felony, you lose the right to vote until you finish your entire sentence, including any period of incarceration as well as probation and parole. At that point, your voting rights are automatically restored. And this is an issue that there was a task force on last year, the Election Integrity Task Force, that looked at the issues of felon voting, and the legislators incorporated many of the task force's recommendations in the bill. And so one of the recommendations was that the Department of Corrections should provide the Secretary of State's office with additional information about who is currently serving a felony sentence, so that we have the information and tools necessary to flag people's records so that they don't make a mistake, or if they come into the polling place, the election judge can say, wait a minute, it looks like you may still be serving your felony sentence. Let's take a step back and look at this before somebody votes. And if you vote when you're not eligible, it's another felony. And so there was a gasp from the audience. And so, trying to help people, prevent people from making mistakes and commit additional crimes, as well as providing more data, will allow us after the election to ensure that nobody voted who should not have, and that if they do, they're caught, and that can be forwarded to the county attorney for prosecution. The bill also clarified that when there is a violation of the voting statute, that it's not the county attorney's office that investigates, that it's actually law enforcement that investigates. Another change in the statute had to do with vouching. And vouching is shorthand for same-day registration. When somebody registers to vote, they're required to provide proof that they live in the precinct. And most voters do that by providing a driver's license that includes their current address in the precinct. Many voters do it by providing a photo ID in combination with a utility bill that has their address in the precinct. But a bunch of voters use the sworn statement of another voter who lives in the precinct and is registered in the precinct. And that other voter swears under penalty of perjury that they personally know that that individual lives in the precinct. That is what is called vouching. So vouching is a sworn statement by another registered voter. And vouching has been part of Minnesota's same-day registration system since voter registration became required statewide in 1973. And several years ago, there was a limit put on the number of people for whom one person could vouch, and it was set at 15. And so one of the changes that the legislators made was reducing that limit from 15 to 8. So it means that if I were going to go into the polling place with several of my neighbors and swear under penalty of perjury that I know that they live in the precinct, I could only do that for 8 of my neighbors, not for 15 of my neighbors. Part of the testimony that was around this piece, this proposal, was that local election officials believe that very, very few people vouch for any more than actually 1 or 2 people, but that there are rare circumstances where people in an apartment building or people in another type of living situation could rely upon one voucher. So there are cases where people vouch for more than 8 that would be impacted by this, but that the vast majority of people who do vouch for very few, and that it would not impact the vast majority of people. It also does not, as it says up there, affect residential facility vouching. And it's like, what's that? So residential facilities were given some special treatment in 2005. And so residential facilities, there's a broad definition. It includes nursing homes and assisted living facilities and homeless shelters and battered women shelters. And what was allowed for those populations is that employees of those facilities were given the authority to vouch, to swear under penalty of perjury, that they personally know that the individual lives at the facility. Especially, the prime example used was people who are staying in a battered women's shelter. Their driver's license does not say that they live at the battered women's shelter. They don't get utility bills there, and they don't hang out with the neighbors. And so although they're eligible to vote, they did not have a way to prove their residence as required. And so a special provision was put into effect for employees of residential facilities. And so the limit on the number of people for whom somebody can vouch does not apply to employees. So let's see. The Omnibus Elections Bill also included some just general cleanup. There were a lot of references in the law. For those of you who go home and read the statutes at night, I'm sure you remember that the law is a throwback to the good old days when every type of election was on a different colored ballot. And so city races, for example, were on the canary yellow ballot, and state races were on the white ballot. And township elections are on the green ballot. And so the statutes were littered with all these references to colors of ballots as if we still used them and as if all the races were on different ballots. And so, but that is not how Minnesotans have voted for years and years. And so part of what was done in the statute was all of the references to colored ballots were repealed to reflect that we now use optical scan ballots, ballots that can be read by those machines where you fill in the oval and put it in the machine and it reads the ballot. So it limited the types of ballots referenced in the statute to the general white optical scan ballot. It still allows for an overflow ballot, which I don't think has been used in Minnesota in many years, but in the case where the ballot, where there are too many things that have to go onto the ballot, the statute still says if that is the case, the county auditor can put the judicial races on a separate ballot. And so it still allows for that. And then the only exception to this is March township election. So there are a few townships in greater Minnesota who are allowed to use green ballots still. But other than that, we got rid of the colors in the ballot, in the statute. Another thing that the legislature did was they passed two different provisions related to electronic rosters. And electronic rosters are basically, the roster is the list of voters when you go into the polling place. And so an electronic roster means that it's on a computer as opposed to a large printout that is separated A to F and G to M, etc. So the legislature was interested in looking at electronic rosters and to see how they could and perhaps should be used in Minnesota. What are the benefits? And some of the potential benefits are that after Election Day, the election judges, as you know, on Election Day have each voter sign the roster if you're pre-registered, or if you're a same-day registrant, you fill out the voter registration application and then actually also sign the roster. And it then takes election officials weeks, if not months, to input all of that data. For same-day registrations, they have to type in all of the information on the form. And for pre-registered voters, they have to, I don't know if you've noticed, but next to where you sign, there's a long barcode. And they go through with an electronic wand and scan those barcodes to indicate in the voter registration system that each of those people voted. And it literally takes weeks, if not months, to do that work. And so that's one of the potential benefits of using computers, is that instead of having to manually input all that data, it could instead be uploaded to be processed. So electronic rosters can save inputting time, and also, even in the polling place, can mean that election judges don't have to do all the typing, because it does allow often for voters to be able to swipe an ID card if they have one, and for that data to be sucked into the computer. So then the election judge would need to type any information that wasn't on your ID card, or if you had moved and were doing same-day registration and had a utility bill, they would need to type in your correct address, but they wouldn't have to necessarily type all of the information over again. So one of the things they authorized was a pilot project for use a few weeks ago in the November elections in 5 communities that were holding city elections. And the communities were Dilworth, Minnetonka, Moorhead, St. Anthony, and St. Paul. And so they used a variety of electronic rosters in their elections a few weeks ago. They were also required to use the paper rosters to ensure that in case the computers went haywire, no data was lost and no voter would be disenfranchised. And so we worked with the election officials for these communities and had, I think, 5 vendors that were interested in being part of the pilot project and had their equipment used as a demonstration. And so we are working with the local election officials who are asking their election judges who worked in the polling places for their feedback, and we'll be collecting all of that information and writing a report that's due to the legislature on January 31st. I think questions are supposed to wait till the end, is that right? Okay, okay. So the other thing that they did with electronic rosters is they also set up a task force to look at the issue of electronic rosters. And so they both wanted to see them in use, see them in action, as well as have some people really study the issue more in depth. And so they set up a task force that includes 15 members. It began meeting in July and will continue meeting right up until the report is due to the legislature, January 31st as well. The meetings are open to the public, and the statute laid out specific things that the task force is supposed to look at. So those things include the electronic roster technology generally. So the task force has had a variety of vendors come in and say, you know, here's our fancy machine, look what it can do. And then another vendor came in and showed off their fancy machine and what it could do. And they also required the task force to look at the ability of the computers to be connected across the state on Election Day. And that's something that they looked at and didn't, at least at this point, doesn't necessarily seem like something the group will probably recommend to the legislature. It seems like there's some security concerns about having all these computers interconnected, as well as there are lots of places in Minnesota that vote in modern, fancy buildings like this one, where I'm sure there is lots of electricity and internet connections, but there are also people that vote in places in greater Minnesota in the town hall where they pull out the snow blower and bring in a generator so there's electricity for the day, where they don't have high-speed internet access nor any internet access. And so, you know, the idea of having a whole network interconnected on Election Day doesn't necessarily seem like something that's very viable. But the task force was required to look at that. They're also required to look at the costs associated with using the electronic rosters. Of course, there's the cost of buying the equipment, as well as ongoing costs with maintenance. Required to look at data security, the reliability of data from other state departments, and they were required to look at whether or not it made sense to import photographs from driver and vehicle services into the computers. And so that's another issue that the task force has been looking at. So that is a summary of what the legislature did this past legislative session and what was included in the omnibus elections bill they passed. And in addition to the legislature passing laws, the Secretary of State is also busy working on voting rights and trying to ensure that all Minnesotans have the opportunity to vote. And so one of the things that was already authorized by law was online voter registration. And so our office launched online voter registration in late September. And so voters now have the option of either filling out the voter registration form, as they have on paper for years, or to fill out an electronic form on our secure website. And I actually have some more, a handout, so if I can hand this off to somebody. So this handout goes through the online voter registration process and how it works a little bit. And basically, the online voter registration process, I don't know if folks have gone to our webpage to check out the new tool, but basically it is a lot like filling out a paper form and asks the same questions about, are you a citizen? Will you be at least 18? And also requires that voters provide a verifiable ID number, which is different than the paper form. One of the things that we were really clear about when designing this form was that we wanted to be sure that it was really secure and that it could only be used by legitimate eligible voters, and that somebody could not sign up Mickey Mouse to vote by typing that in on this form. And so one of the requirements is that voters who apply online to register need to provide a Minnesota driver's license number, a state ID card number, or the last 4 digits of their social security number, as well as an email address. And then behind the scenes, after they submit all of the required information, including an ID number, our computers work with computers at Driver and Vehicle Services and the Social Security Administration and verify that the person's name and date of birth and ID number reside in another government database. And if they don't, then the person receives an email that says, "I'm sorry, we were not able to process your registration. We were not able to verify your information. If you think you made an error, feel free to try again or fill out a paper form." But it only works if we can actually verify that you exist in another government database. Once we go through this check, and it does verify that you are a person in another government database, then it is queued for the county election worker to process. And once the county reviews it, as they do all of the paper registrations, the main difference being that they would have had to have typed in all that information, and in this case, it's typed in for them, and probably accurately, since you are probably better at typing your own name and remembering how to spell it than somebody who's never seen it before is. Then the county worker looks at it, and once they approve it, the applicant is notified by email. You are now registered to vote in Minnesota. In addition, they are then sent a postcard by mail, as all new and updated registrations are, to verify that they actually live at the address that they gave us. So the online voter registration system, we believe, is going to save local election officials quite a bit of money because it's going to save them from the time and energy of having to type in all the registrations. It's more secure than the paper forms because it requires a verifiable ID number. It also allows voters to fill out the form in, the privacy of their own home, whereas paper voter registration forms are often collected at the state fair or at the bus stop, and you fill out the information with all this private information, then you hand it to someone and hope they turn it in. And instead of handing it to somebody you may have just met, you are instead typing it into a secure website and submitting it directly. So that is online voter registration, and let me see. I already went over most of this, sorry. So they must provide a verifiable ID number. We verify through Driver and Vehicle Services or Social Security, and once verified, the county approves it and emails them and sends them a postcard. State agencies are required under Minnesota law to provide voter registration services for their staff and people with whom they interact. And so they can either do that by providing a link to the voter registration, online voter registration tool, or they can do that by providing forms at their locations. The other thing that we're doing, and it's super exciting that I'm doing this presentation today because we made a big announcement today, although it doesn't seem to make the news, is that, not yet at least, but we are in the process of adopting administrative rules. And so the legislature makes laws generally and often delegates to agencies or like the Office of the Secretary of State to figure out some of the details as people that work more closely with the subjects at hand. And so the legislature over the years has delegated quite a few subjects on which the Secretary has the authority to create rules, and rules are part of Minnesota law. So when somebody says the law says, that could either mean the statute passed by the legislators or it could mean an administrative rule. Both are considered law. And the rulemaking process is not legislative. Instead, there is an administrative law judge that oversees the process. And so basically the way it works is we last June said that we were thinking about doing rules on a variety of subjects related to elections, and if anyone had any ideas, they should let us know. And we received comments from a variety of organizations and individuals who had suggestions for changes they thought we should make. The next step in the process is that we propose some rules, which is basically the equivalent of a legislator introducing a bill. It's saying, here's what we're thinking. And that's what we did today. We announced our proposed rules, and that kicks off a 30-day formal comment period where anyone and everyone, including everyone that's listening, has the opportunity, if you'd like, to review the rules and provide a comment on what you like, what you don't like, things you wish that we would do, things that you think should be tweaked. And then there will be a hearing on January 3rd in front of the administrative law judge. He reviews all of the comments as well. We'll listen to testimony at the hearing, and then there's a post-hearing comment period during which everyone is again encouraged to provide your comments and insights. And then after all of the comment periods, the administrative law judge thinks deeply and writes a report on whether we have made the case that the proposals are needed and reasonable. And if they are needed and reasonable, then he will approve them, and he'll issue that report right around the end of February, beginning of March. And if they are needed and reasonable, then the secretary has the opportunity to go ahead and actually adopt those rules, and they would be effective for the state primary next summer. So, and this is a chart that shows all of those steps I just laid out. So that shows who has elections, or who just had elections, which isn't very interesting now. But before I get to the next legislative session, the other side of the piece of paper that I handed out lays out what was included in our exciting announcement about the new rules. And most of the rule changes that we're proposing are actually a direct result of the, wow, I didn't know there were graphics. That's super exciting. We're going to move back so that we're not distracted by these graphics. Okay, so sorry about that. So most of the proposed changes in the rulemaking that we're doing are a direct result of changes that the legislature made, because the statute provides general guidance and then the rules are very tied to the statute by providing often more details. And so when the legislature makes changes to the statute, we almost always need to go in and change the rules to then comply with the changes they've made to the statute. And we have done rulemaking every election cycle for the past 4 years, since Secretary Ritchie took office. So most of the changes are directly related to the omnibus elections bill that was passed. Some of the more interesting, probably, changes that we're proposing relate to providing proof of residence for same-day registration. And so you'll see on kind of the bottom half of this sheet, it lays out the proposed additions. So as I said before, most people who do same-day registration who have to provide proof of residence show a Minnesota driver's license with a current address. But another option for voters for decades has been that they have had the ability to show a photo ID in combination with a utility bill. So the photo ID shows who they are. The utility bill has to have their current address in the precinct and be due within 30 days before or after the election. So after looking over calls that we got on our voter hotline during the last several elections, as well as conversations with local election officials and comments from public interest groups, we have decided that we need to propose that one of the options voters should have is the ability to use a different state's driver's license as part of that combination. Again, they'd need to have another document that showed their address, but that if they moved here from Wisconsin or Florida 30 days ago and have not yet gotten a Minnesota driver's license, that is still a valid document to show who they are and that they should be allowed to do that. We also looked to see whether other states that allow voters to do same-day registration use these proofs. And what we found is that the majority of other states that have same-day registration allow the use of another state's driver's license. So it seemed like a pretty reasonable suggestion. Another change that we're suggesting is that high school students should be able to use their high school IDs to register in combination with a bill. College students have, for many, many years, been able to use their college IDs. High school students have not. But as we were thinking about 18-year-olds and studies that show that teenagers are waiting later and later to get their driver's licenses, what might they have in their wallet to show proof of residence or to show who they are? And for many, it's likely to be a high school ID. And so it seemed reasonable to propose that they should be able to use that, especially since the legislature reduced the number of people for whom one person could vouch. And if we don't want to have people relying upon somebody else's sworn statement that they live in the precinct, then we need to ensure that there are documents that they can use instead. So part of what we're doing is trying to fill gaps that people might have used vouching to ensure that there are documents that they can use instead. So those are the two photo IDs that we're looking at adding to the list of what can be used in combination. We're also looking at adding some other documents that can be used in combination with a photo ID. So these documents would have to be current and have your address in the precinct. So one of the documents that we're looking at is a banking or credit card statement. Because what we found is that for many people, their utilities are included in their rent. And so they don't get utility bills to bring to the polling place. And for a lot of young people, and maybe some not so young people, they're on mom and dad's cell phone plan. And so the cell phone bill goes to mom and dad, not to them. And so they don't have a utility bill, but they probably do get a credit card bill or at least have a bank account. And so another piece of official mail that they get is the credit card statement or the banking statement. So we're looking to authorize those. Like the other suggestions that we're making, many other states allow for use of these as proof of residence. Another thing that we're looking at adding are rent or mortgage statements or residential lease agreements. And in some ways, this is kind of a no-brainer, because if what you're supposed to prove is where you live, what proves it better than a document related to your rent or your mortgage or your lease? And for years, election judges have said that voters come in and said, I just bought the house up the street, here's the packet from the mortgage broker. And they've said, I'm sorry, you need to bring in your Xcel Energy bill. Please go home. And they're like, but I spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. But it was not an authorized proof, despite how common sense it sounds. And so one of the proposals is that voters should be able to use a rental statement or a mortgage statement or a lease agreement. Of course, again, it would have to be current through Election Day, and it would need to show their address in the precinct. But this is especially helpful if, for example, all of the utility bills are in someone else's name, but they're on the lease. They could bring that and show that to prove that they live there in combination with a photo ID. The final rule proposal that I want to note is the bottom bullet point on here, and this relates to online billing. And one of the things that we found over the past decade is that more and more people are getting their bills online, and that the law has always required that people bring in an original utility bill. But what does that mean when you get it online and it's not mailed to you? And so for years, we've actually encouraged election judges to accept either a printout of an electronic bill, or if voters bring in an tablet or their phone and can bring up the bill and show the necessary parts that it's due within 30 days and this is my name and this is my address, that is their original bill. And so one of the things we're doing is just solidifying in the rules that this is the standard to ensure that it's used statewide and that there are no questions about whether or not that is allowed. So I'll say just a few more things and then leave time for questions. The upcoming legislative session, the governor has called the unsession, which he wants to really focus on getting rid of laws that aren't needed and unnecessary regulations. And so it's also a short session. It doesn't start until the very end of February and is required by the Constitution to end by the middle of May. And so it's much shorter than most legislative sessions. So in addition, when it relates to elections and election law, the fact that the 2014 election is right around the corner will also be present in people's minds, both because everyone in the House is up for election and because with the primary in August, it's very difficult to make major election changes in an election year because absentee voting for the primary begins in late June and candidate filing is in late May, and many would argue that candidates should know what the rules are before they sign up to run. And so it's hard to make big changes in an election year because even though the legislature will adjourn at least one whole day before the candidate filing period starts, that doesn't leave a lot of time for local or state election officials, if changes were made, to figure out, okay, what does this mean? What forms do we need? What training do we need to do? And so we don't actually expect many, if any, major changes past this session that would apply to the upcoming election. But one of the things that will be on the table, and folks probably will talk about, is early voting. Not for 2014, but probably looking out for 2016, because as I just explained, there's not time to implement it for 2014. But early voting, again, which means not only being able to go in to your county auditor, city clerk's office, and fill out a ballot early, but instead of having to fold it up and fill out extra forms and put it into an envelope, which then a ballot board needs to take time afterwards and look at the envelope and look at your forms and be sure you crossed all your I's and, no, crossed all your T's and dotted all your I's, and make sure that you didn't make any mistakes in filling out the paperwork, and then open up all the envelopes and feed them into the machines. Instead of doing that, you, like you would on election day, would have the opportunity to actually just fill out the ballot and put it directly into the machine. So you could leave with a peace of mind that you have voted, it has been counted, there's no worry that you filled out the form wrong and it won't be counted. This again shows that Minnesota is fairly unique both in the country and definitely in the upper Midwest in not allowing early voting for Minnesotans. Absentee balloting costs a lot more than early voting. Partially it has to do with the extra forms and paperwork required in all the envelopes that you need to put your ballot in and just the printing costs, as well as the cost of paying people to check the forms and then open all the envelopes and feed them into the machines. But it also early voting would reduce lines at the polls as well as lines for in-person absentee voting. Because if you choose to go into your city clerk's office or your county auditor's office, everyone, of course, needs to take the time to fill out all those forms and fold up their ballot and put it in all those envelopes. And if instead, like at the polling place, you could fill it out and put it into the machine, the line would go much faster. It also reduces the risk of voter error, both on the forms as well as when you put your ballot into the machine. If you've made a mistake on the ballot, for example, by voting for too many candidates in a race, the machine kicks it back to you and you have an opportunity to fix it. Whereas if you've instead put it into an envelope, you'll never know that you made a mistake. When the election judges open the envelopes, they don't know whose ballot is whose. They'll feed it in, but there's no way to know who you really wanted to vote for. Another issue that the legislature will probably be discussing is the restoration of voting rights. And as I mentioned previously, Minnesota takes away the right to vote for anyone who has been convicted of a felony and requires that they not vote. They're not allowed to vote again until they've finished their complete sentence, including probation and parole. And in this map, the black states are states where being convicted of a felony results in permanent disenfranchisement, so they are never allowed to vote again. Gray states, like Wyoming, are permanent disenfranchisement for some felons. So in those states, it depends upon what you've been convicted of. Blue states like Minnesota are states that disenfranchise people until they're no longer on probation. So they've completed both probation and parole. Light blue states like South Dakota and Colorado are states that allow probationers but not parolees to vote. So if you're on parole, you can't vote. If you're on probation, you can. So they make a distinction between those two categories. Light green states, so Illinois, Indiana, are states that automatically restore rights upon release from prison. And so there has been discussion in Minnesota about potentially moving towards a model more like that one. You'll notice that North Dakota has this model as well. So at least one of our neighbors has this model. So that if you're in prison, you cannot vote. And if you're out of prison, you can vote. You might notice that Vermont and Maine are actually a slightly different color than everyone else. They are states that never revoke the right to vote, even if you've been convicted of a felony. So they allow people in prison to vote. Nobody is proposing that for Minnesota, as far as I know. But folks are looking at the North Dakota model, which says if you're in prison, you cannot vote. If you're out, you can, which has some benefits to it. For both people who have been convicted of felonies as well as election officials. So this was one of the items that the Governor's Task Force on Election Integrity urged the legislature to consider, because after looking at how complex our system is, they determined that this was definitely worth consideration. And also recommended that those who have been convicted of a felony, if we keep our current system, at least be told that they're not allowed to vote. Because one of the things that the task force heard is that those who have been convicted of felonies are not consistently told in a uniform way that they have lost the right to vote. And so it's not surprising that if you don't tell someone they're not allowed to do something, that they're going to occasionally do it. And that's what we have seen in Minnesota. As I mentioned before, the legislature did adopt many of the recommendations of the Task Force on Election Integrity. The one that they did not adopt that was related to our current system had to do with notification to felons. They did adopt recommendations related to greater data sharing so that people could be prevented from voting if they show up at the polling place and caught after the fact. But one of the recommendations was ensuring that they're sent a letter before each state election that says, you know, state records show that you are serving a felony sentence, in which case you should not vote. It is a felony. Please do not do so, which we believe would have a big deterrent effect, both because they would be told and therefore not want to vote, but also they would know that the state knew and would understand that if they did vote, they would be caught. It also would provide notice in cases where the records may be inaccurate and would give them an opportunity to get it cleared up before Election Day. But that was kind of the one piece related to the current system that the Task Force on Election Integrity suggested that the legislature did not adopt, that they might consider. Something else that the legislature might look at has to do with emergency preparedness. This came up right before the 2012 election with Hurricane Sandy, and there was a lot of disruption on the East Coast, and they had to move polling places around, and some governors authorized people to vote absentee who normally don't vote absentee. And so it is something that our legislature should look at some point, but with the unsession, I'm not sure whether it's something they'll spend a lot of time looking at now. We will also be busy doing voter outreach and really encouraging people to vote, because what we found is that presidential election years, Minnesota has great turnout. I think this underestimates our turnout. I think it's closer to 80%, but between 75 and 80% of eligible voters in Minnesota turn out in a presidential year, as it shows at the bottom. But in a non-presidential year, in years where the governor is the top of the ticket, we have closer to 55% voter turnout in Minnesota, which means that that's about 800,000 voters who vote in presidential years who do not vote in non-presidential years. We also look at voter turnout. You can look at it by age and gender and see that turnout definitely goes up as folks age, and it appears that at least younger women vote more than men, although there's not a huge gap between men and women. They tend to vote pretty consistently. And this is my Julie's presentation, who works with me on government relations. This is her contact information, not my contact information, so I will forward it. So that is the end of my presentation. I am happy to answer any questions y'all might have. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and share this early snowy evening with you.
Beth, I just wanted to ask, I know that you mentioned earlier that if there was going to be a runoff election or a recount,
Right.
Someone would have to pay for it by themselves.
No, I'm
mean,
sorry. So
If it's within a certain range.
right.
Is that what
So
you said?
so Minnesota law provides for a publicly funded recount under a certain range. And so the legislature changed that threshold.
Right.
And so the threshold for statewide elections is now 1/4%. And so that means that basically in a gubernatorial year, if the race was within about 5,000 votes, that the public would pay. If it was more than 5,000 votes, that the candidate would still have the option of having the recount. It's just that they would have to pay the bills.
Yeah, I understand that. It's
Okay.
just that I was wondering, what would that cost? If it's a gubernatorial?
Right. A recount, I think, would cost quite a bit at a gubernatorial level. Like a statewide recount would cost quite a bit. The candidate also has the option, and candidates for legislature and local races have done this occasionally. They also have the option to do a partial recount and to say, so occasionally legislative candidates have said, I lost the election, that's really disappointing, it's hard to believe, but I also lost my hometown. Like, how did that happen? Let's recount those precincts just to be sure.
Oh, they can be selective.
So they can be selective. They can select, I believe it's up to 5 precincts that they want to have recounted. And that's, I don't think that's too much money. But I don't know about the cost off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
Just curious about that. I'm wondering if political parties then would be able to support a person's recount efforts, paying for them.
Yeah, I believe that political parties would be able to. I know that candidates in recent major recounts have set up funds to raise money to help defray recount expenses. Now, in those cases, that's to pay for their lawyers, not to pay for the many hours that our staff or even greater hours that local election officials or election judges put in recounting every ballot.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Hey, Beth?
Yes.
This is tall. You talked about the pilot program for the electronic rosters.
Yes.
And some of the work that went into doing some evaluations, some of the dual entry that people were doing. I'm kind of wondering about the governance process for going through that evaluation and choosing a solution and then funding that solution.
Right. So again, there was the pilot program, and so those 5 communities used electronic rosters in their elections a few weeks ago to see how it worked. And the legislature just required that we provide a report to them by January 31st and laid out a few factors that needed to be included in the report. But so part of what we're doing is we are working with the county auditors and the city clerks, and they are working with the election judges that worked in those polling places to gather feedback and input. And then the election judges are sharing it with the cities, who are sharing it with the counties, who are sharing it with us. And so there is a reporting kind of procedure in place for that. The task force, which is separate than the pilot project, is looking at whether electronic rosters are something we want to move toward in Minnesota. And one of the questions that both the task force will be looking at and ultimately the legislature will have to look at is the cost question. How much does it cost to invest in both the hardware that would need to be in the polling place, the laptop if that's what's used, and potentially the card reader if you want people to be able to swipe an ID, as well as printers. How much does that cost? As well as software, because you need to have software to collect the data, and as well as programming to ultimately import it into the statewide voter registration system. So the task force will be looking at, and the legislature will be looking at the cost items and whether the legislature wants to kick in money for these or whether they want to leave it up to local communities. Local election officials will also be looking at their numbers and estimates of cost savings to determine whether they believe there's enough cost savings to make it financially worthwhile to invest in the technology up front.
Great, good, thanks.
You're welcome.
My name is Wendy, and I have a couple questions for you. One question I had was your restoration of voting rights for the felonies.
Yes.
What kind of increase in voting are you looking at? Or is it just for out of safety precautions because they're just not getting notified and you don't want to give them a second felony?
That's a really great question because I think I kind of introduced the topic but didn't talk enough about some of the benefits of changing the voting rights. So some of the benefits of allowing people to vote once they're out of prison. One is that felons would, people who have been convicted of felonies, studies show that it helps with reintegration in society if they are allowed to fully participate in civic life. And that it helps them feel like they're more connected to the law and more interested in being law-abiding if they have a say in who's creating the laws. It also provides potentially cost savings and clarity for election administrators because election judges wouldn't have to worry about whether or not somebody who shows up to vote is a felon, because unless they had a ball and chain, they would be eligible to vote, and they wouldn't have to worry about that. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, that's good. I have one other question. You were talking about voter outreach, and I was wondering, can you view an actual ballot online before you go to the polling place?
You can, and actually in 2012, we launched a new tool on our website called My Ballot, which allows voters to enter their address, and two things actually come up. One is you can look at an actual PDF image of your ballot for your actual precinct. You can print it out and fill it out and bring it with you if you want. The other thing that comes up is a list of all of the candidates who will appear on your ballot. And if they have provided us with a link to their website, it will provide those links. So it's a great way for voters to educate themselves ahead of Election Day, because it not only says, here are the 4 people running for legislature for your seat, but then you're able right there and then to click on the link and go to their webpage and learn about them.
I was talking to a neighbor who had mentioned also that he wasn't able to find an actual ballot online, and I didn't have the information to give him, and so that was important to me. I thought, yeah, that would be good. I would, because I'm always calling my mom, or Debbie, and there was one other question. Okay, that's it.
Great.
Thanks.
When you were talking about people coming into the polls and swiping their IDs and stuff, I got kind of faint because it reminded me so much of the action to ask people to provide an ID before they could vote, registered or not registered. And at that time, we said not everybody has an ID. You know, when they're no longer driving, they don't necessarily run down to the courthouse and get an ID or something like that. So you would always have to have a paper backup, is that correct? For registered voters?
No. So if we move toward having electronic rosters, it does not mean that everyone will be required to have a photo ID. What it means is that if voters come into the polling place, there may be an option, if you have an ID, to swipe it and to have them pull up your record. Or if you're doing same-day registration, to have you swipe your ID and to have some of the information pre-populated. But there would always be the option, if you didn't have an ID, to come in and tell the election judge, I am Beth Fraser, and they would just type in Beth Fraser, and all the information could be entered manually.
Okay, or would you still have would they still have the opportunity, if they were a registered voter, to sign, or would it all be electronic with the election judge doing that? You know, if they didn't have an ID.
Right, if they didn't have an ID, if we move towards electronic rosters, it's likely that they would pull up your record in the computer and then print something out for you to sign. And so regardless of
I
whether or
see.
not
So-
you had an ID, there would be something for you to sign. But even if you didn't have an ID, they would want to use the computer, because that's going to make it easier for local election officials after the fact to just upload the fact that, 4,000 people voted in this precinct, as opposed to having to go through one by one and wand each of those names in the paper rosters.
Okay, and then my other question is, do we really have a problem with long lines at the polls in Minnesota? Has that been a problem?
There are long lines in some precincts in Minnesota. And so there are some polling places where there are not a problem with lines, and there are some polling places where there were lines of over an hour in the 2012 election. And so part of it depends upon the turnout and the expectations and how the polling place was set up. But there were definitely at least some areas with long lines.
And then you stated that in some states, felons are allowed to vote even when they're in prison.
Yes.
What, is it, do they vote in, like absentee in the precinct that they last lived, or that they're registered, or how would that, maybe you don't know.
I don't know, actually. I don't
Okay,
know.
thank you.
This is a procedural question, and I think it's pretty silly, but I'm curious if somebody, like a felon, votes, after all is said and done, you don't know who they voted for, so how do you subtract their vote?
You cannot subtract their vote.
So once it's done, and that's all there is to it?
Yes.
Okay, I was just curious.
Yes.
Thank you.
Deb Brinkman, I have another question. In the news, that there's obviously some people that aren't real happy with online voter registration. So I'm wondering if you could just spend a couple minutes talking about what's going on there, kind of what people might be upset about, and maybe any other things that you think, as a general population here, that we should be watching for, where people might be trying to disenfranchise voters that, maybe we shouldn't have to worry about.
Sure. So the Secretary of State in Minnesota is the chief election official and is a separate constitutional officer, separate from the governor and the attorney general, and has certain inherent authorities as the chief election official, and has also, there have been laws passed over the years that have said that the Secretary of State may, for example, engage in activities and programs that will increase voter registration and voter turnout in Minnesota. And Secretary Ritchie is very committed to ensuring that voters are informed and educated. And one of the things that we have done since he's been in office to help voters find out more about the candidates and be more informed is we have launched a series of online tools for voters. And so in 2008, we launched a special website for military and overseas voters to help them learn about voting rights and voting processes in Minnesota. And in 2010, we launched a tool to allow voters to look up their voter registration status and ensure that they are registered at the address where they currently live. We also launched a tool so that voters could look up the status of their absentee ballot. And those two tools actually, in order to ensure that we're protecting private information and not allowing you to look up my information, we require voters to provide information such as their full date of birth, or to look up the status of your absentee ballot, you have to provide the ID number that you put on your absentee ballot application. And so we actually, in those tools, required people to provide all of the same information that they ultimately now provide in the online voter registration tool. But so we have been launching tools. The final tool that we launched previously is the My Ballot tool, which I talked about, which allows people to pull up their ballot and find information about the candidates. And so the logical next step was to not only allow people to look up their registration online, but if there's a problem with it, to fix it. And so this is something that has been done in a variety of other states. It was first done in Arizona in 2002 by then Secretary of State Jan Brewer. It was then done in Washington State by Secretary of State Sam Reed, both of whom I would note are Republicans. It has since been more broadly adopted and is in place in 14 other states. And states are continuing to adopt the use of online voter registration. And so we looked at this and said, do we need to get legislative authority to do this? And we said, well, we didn't get legislative authority to launch these other online tools that require exactly the same information. We have a statute that says that the Secretary is allowed to engage in activities and programs that promote voter registration and voter turnout. There's another statute that says that encourages state agencies, including the Secretary of State, to bring forms and activities online to help facilitate the use of state government and commerce in the state. And so looking at all of these different laws, we concluded we have the authority. This is a great tool for Minnesotans. It makes it easier for Minnesotans to register. It's more secure than filling out a paper form with a lot of private information and handing it to a stranger at a bus stop. It will provide great cost savings at the local level for local election officials who have to type in all of the information. In Maricopa County, Arizona, where they first started online voter registration, they estimate that it costs approximately 83 cents to process a paper registration, and it costs approximately 3 cents to process an online voter registration. And so we're talking about, over the course of years, substantial cost savings for local governments who are continued to be squeezed. So it looked like a win for voters, a win for local election officials, and something that we should do, and so we did. And unfortunately, some legislators in particular feel that they should have had the opportunity to specifically authorize this. And we have pointed to these various statutes and places where we believe we have the authority to do that, and they apparently, at least some of them, are not convinced, and 2 organizations as well as 4 legislators have sued the office over the launch of the online voter registration tool and requested a special process with an expedited hearing. And so the hearing will be on Friday, December 13th, which we believe is lucky for us. And our legal brief is due on Wednesday, December 4th. And so on that date, we will issue our legal brief, which really lays out all of our legal arguments and why we did this and why this is a great thing and why we had the authority to do it. And, you know, we are looking forward to this moving forward. We do believe it's going to be a great tool. And the other tool that we launched on exactly the same date, which doesn't seem to have gotten the same attention, which is odd because it actually provides almost exactly the same function, is a tool for military and overseas voters, which allows them to apply for their absentee ballots online. So on the same day, we launched online voter registration for all voters, and we launched online absentee ballot applications for military and overseas voters, and which actually, under federal law, doubles as a voter registration application. And yet, the people who have raised concerns and brought a lawsuit have only raised the concerns and brought the lawsuit about one of the two tools that we launched on that day. Although one would seem to think that the question of authority and whether or not we should have done this and had the authority to do it should be the same.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, good luck. I mean, I think we're all pulling for you here. What's the next new tool that you guys have kind of in the works? Can you say, or is it top secret, or?
We are continuing to look for opportunities to help voters, so I'm not going to say anything more right now. But I mean, today we made our big announcement about the rules. That's the exciting news of the day, was the rules and the new proofs of residence and the streamlining that we're doing. And again, I would remind everyone there's a public comment period and would encourage everyone to review the 60-page rule document and the 47-page single-space statement of need and reasonableness, and so that nobody ever has to say statement of need and reasonableness again. We call it the SONAR. So I encourage you to read the rules and the SONAR, which are posted on our website. The SONAR is a document in which we lay out why we have the authority to propose the rules, but then also for every single change, lay out why it is both needed and reasonable. So we are proposing to move this comma, and it is needed because, and it is reasonable because. It's a great read. And I often think if legislators had to write SONARs for their bills, there wouldn't be quite as many bills. But anyway. Is there another question?
No, I just had a comment.
Okay.
I stumbled on your website for looking up ballots
Mm-hmm.
for my particular district, et cetera. It even lists the judges, the water departments, everything you're going to see on the ballot, and I would bug my young friends, "You're going to vote? You're going to vote?" "Oh, I don't know where I'm going to vote, and I don't know who's running." I go, "Where do you live?" And I type it in, and I would print their ballot, and I go, "Look at the people who are running. What are your interests? What do you want done? Who represents you?" And that's how you vote. If you don't know who to vote for, then leave it blank. People think they have to fill in every square, right?
Right.
So I just say, go for the big ones then. But here's your ballot, and two, it tells you where to vote.
Right.
So it's a wonderful website. I tell everybody about it.
Well, thank you. That's nice to hear. Yes, so people should go to MNVotes, MNVOTES.org, and you can find all of our online tools. Google it. Yes, or Google it. Or use another search engine of your choice. Well, again, I want to thank you so much for your time and for the opportunity to spend this evening with you and talk about voting rights in Minnesota. And thanks to all of you and to the League of Women Voters for all the great work that you do and for protecting our voting rights.
Thanks again, Beth. We really appreciated having you here. Thanks also to the City of St. Louis Park for allowing us to host our program here. Thanks to Reg for doing the video for us. Thanks again to the League of Women Voters here at St. Louis Park for coordinating this event, and it's great to see so many people out, especially, during the snow and everything. There's still some refreshments in back there, so I'd like to encourage you to take a few moments after our program here tonight and grab a cookie, or grab a little bit of refreshments, and stay and visit with someone. If you know of anybody that is looking to join the League of Women Voters, this league here in St. Louis Park, I haven't been a member for too long, but they're just a great group of women and very energetic. Stay really engaged in the community, so it's been really a lot of fun. I hope if you're not a member, you'd consider joining us. The core mission of the League of Women Voters, of course, is voting rights, and so this program here tonight was especially close to our hearts. So we really appreciate all the progress that Minnesota is making, and we appreciate the strong voter turnout that we get. It's certainly something to be proud of and something to be thankful of, especially in this time of season. So thank you to everyone in our viewing audience as well, and I hope you have a great evening. Bye now.